I'm Nicolette Duck. I'm a board member at the Commonwealth Heritage Forum. And today we've got Tim Barnard, who's going to talk to us about Singapore and the network of Imperial Botanic Gardens. And talking to Tim earlier, I gather it's one of the most preserved imperial gardens in the world. It's a World Heritage Site as well, which I gather is one of only 3, along with Kirstenbosch in Cape Town and Kew Gardens. And we've already had a talk about Kew, so if you want to catch up on the Kew talk, it's on our website. So Tim Barnard is an associate professor at the Department of History at the National University of Singapore, where his research and teaching focus on the environmental and cultural history of island of Southeast Asia. And he's author of several monographs and edited books on the environmental history of Singapore, including Nature's Colony, Empire, Nation, and Environment in the Singapore Botanic Gardens, and Imperial Creatures, Humans and Other Animals in Colonial Singapore. So I think this is going to be a most interesting talk. So I think I'm not going to say any more, and I'll hand over to Tim. And then after he's finished, we will take any questions at the end. So if you do have any, put them in the chat, and then we will obviously have a chat about them afterwards. Thanks, Tim. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicolette. I would first of all like to thank everyone for joining me from around the world. I mean, literally, it seems we have people from Jamaica to England to Australia and then to Singapore. So that's always a nice thing. One thing I will do now is I'll just take over the screen so that I'll share my screen so you can see the slides, and then you can see images that are more interesting than me just talking away. So let me just go ahead and do that, and we can take over and we'll see what's going on. So as Nicolette mentioned, the subject of today's talk, I titled Nature's Colony, but it's really about Singapore and how it fit into imperial botany and imperial networks of botany. As she mentioned, the previous talk was about Kew and the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. And so it's very appropriate that it was the first of these talks, particularly for the Commonwealth Society here, a society related to the Commonwealth. So I just simply want to talk about another one of these botanic gardens, and one that was seen more as a branch of Kew from a global perspective, but had very important influence and impact on local history and the local environment here in Southeast Asia or in Singapore. So let's just get going on this. And since many of you may not have been to Singapore before, may not be familiar with Singapore very much, what I'll be talking about today is how the Singapore Botanic Gardens had, while it opened or began as a recreational park in the 1850s, it has had since that time a tremendous impact on the environment, the politics, the society, and everything beyond Singapore and its boundaries. If you look at this PowerPoint slide, Singapore is literally just a small island. It's 30 kilometers by 50 kilometers at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. So in kind of the colored area you see on the map to the right, it's the pinkish one toward the bottom right corner. Now, Singapore was an important port. As you can see from the map, it is based or located in the southern portion of the Straits of Malacca. And that meant it was very important for trade or trade routes between China and Japan. Now, for us to understand that and to understand the role of botanic gardens, you also need to have a bit of basic Singaporean history, a bit of a background. Now, while there had been peoples living in Singapore prior to imperialism, people would move in and off the island and form kingdoms or states in different places. The beginning of, we'll say, modern Singaporean history or imperial Singapore history began in 1819 when the English East Company landed and signed a treaty with a local ruler and gained the right to trade off the island very quickly. They gained control over the island itself in the 1820s. And so basically between 1819 and the 1860s, it was English East India Company port. It was very important for providing water and to refurbish the ships on their way between China and India. Now, beginning in 1867, Singapore became a crown colony. It became part of the Strait Settlements, and then later British Malaya, which is what you basically see on the map to the left. And that lasted until about 1942, when the Japanese invaded. And what is termed here, of course, we know it's part of World War II, but here it's usually termed the Japanese occupation, because Japanese forces occupied Singapore from 42 to 45. After 45, there was an extremely complex period of decolonization, which in a talk of this nature, we really can't get into. Just know that Singapore became a colony again of the British. It became part of Malaya. It then was part of Malaysia. It then got kicked out of Malaysia. And ultimately by 1965, it became an independent island nation, a very small nation, 30 kilometers by 50 kilometers. And so it's been that way since 1965. Now that you've had the quick and easy history of Singapore, let's actually get to what we're here for, which is the Botanic Gardens. Okay. Now, when the British arrived in 1819, I mentioned that it was mainly as a trade port, whose goal was to, of course, trade natural products, which could range from opium to China, tea, buying tea from China. And it was part of these larger trade networks. The key point I want to make, however, is that trade was based around products of the land. I mean, agricultural products. These ranged from tea and opium to, in Southeast Asia, what is known as the holy trinity of cloves, nutmeg, and mace. You might have black pepper, you have cinnamon, and these were grown here in the tropics. We're right along the equator here. And then these products were then shipped back to Europe, where you could make fortunes. And that was the goal of the East India Company, to trade these products. And as an East India Company trade port, they needed to have an enhanced understanding of how to cultivate these products, introduction of new plants. And so this fell to Botanic Gardens. And East India Company officials, knowing that this was important, established a Botanic Garden soon after the Singaporean, soon after they settled in Singapore. And there was one in Singapore from 1824 to 1829, and then it fell into disrepair. And then there was a second one from 1836 to 1843. These were both in the same site, and they were both near the port, literally a few hundred meters from the ocean. On the map, you can see on the right, I have it circled in red there. It says Botanical and Experimental Garden. This is a map of Singapore from the 1820s. And you can see how they wanted to lay it out. The importance of this Botanical and Experimental Garden, as you can see, is it's in the center of the port, just right behind the open square and the main church. Now, both of these Botanic Gardens fell into disrepair simply because, frankly, they weren't needed. As people began to open up agricultural land on the island, tropical rainforest, they didn't need to experiment. They could simply go out into the interior and plant plants and see how they worked. And so the people who were focused on botany thought, well, why do we need a special garden? We'll just do it in the interior, at least in the first few decades of colonial rule. This leads us to the Botanic Garden we want to talk about, and that is the Singapore Botanic Gardens. Now, following 4 decades of agricultural expansion in Singapore, which, as I mentioned, 30 by 50, it's about 500 square kilometers, Singapore became mainly cultivated land. They literally deforested the entire island by the late 1850s, early 1860s. It simply became a huge plantation. And this led to a lot of just the landscape changing, the weather, it became a less inviting interior that you would want to go to. So what the elite decided to do is they created an agro-horticultural society, and their main goal was to create a private garden that could work as a respite from the dust and the heat of the colonial port and from the cultivated land that was growing pepper, gambier, and other products. And so what they did was they hired a man named Lawrence Niven, who was a gardener essentially, and using English landscape design, which was developed by Capability Brown, they created an English garden with tropical plants in the tropics. By English landscape design, of course, it means rolling hills. Nothing is, in a sense, geometric. You have curves. It goes with the flow of the landscape. You can see at the top here, that's an early photo of the garden. And you can see where the roads aren't necessarily straight. And there's numerous rolling hills within the garden, even to today. Now, the Singapore Botanic Gardens remained a private botanic garden, a private garden for 15 years. You had to pay to be a member. It was only open to the public it changed over the 15 years, but usually about 1 day a week, 2 days a week, sometimes. And it was a place where the elite, which of course primarily means British elite, could go to get away from the crowds and get away from the dust. And you can see on the bottom here, that is a painting made of a woman with her pet dogs, a very 19th century development also, enjoying the gardens as they were. The problem was the people who ran the gardens were economically incompetent, basically. The amount of money raised by membership could not pay for all of the construction going on, the creation of this English landscape design, the buildings being constructed, and the salaries of the superintendent and such. And so the Botanic Gardens became bankrupt by the late 1860s. And this is important because it then links into Singaporean history. Because in 1867, as I mentioned earlier, Singapore and the Strait Settlements, the two other ports, Malacca and Penang, became crown colonies known as the Strait Settlements. And what this meant was it had direct rule. Prior to 1867, Singapore actually was a branch, if you will, of the East India Company in India. Officials in Singapore answered to Calcutta and then Delhi. They were literally the bottom of the totem pole. Nobody cared about what was going on in Singapore. After 1867, it becomes a colony, and it becomes an important link within the British Empire on which the sun never sat. Now, as they created a, let's say, more direct imperial government over Singapore and the Straits, they also had to bring with them, of course, the various technologies and ideas and approaches to imperialism that they had. And one of those was botany and the importance of growing particular plants. And so, faced with a bankrupt Botanic Gardens, by 1874, the government assumed responsibility. They took over the gardens. They said they would pay for it. And by the way, one of the first things that happened was the Singapore Botanic Gardens no longer was a private park. It was a government park, and it was open to the public. Anyone could visit at any time. And that remains true to today. And today, the Singapore Botanic Gardens is the most visited botanic garden in the world on an annual basis. In my opinion, mainly it's a beautiful place to visit. Everyone should visit, but it's free. That always helps. When the government took over in 1874, they asked for assistance. Previously, the Botanic Gardens had just been run by locals who, local British elites who had an interest in horticulture, for example, or gardening. Now, as part of the British government, they write to the Colonial Office, and then the Colonial Office turns to Kew and recommends people to run the Botanic Gardens. Now, this system is described in an excellent book by Richard Drayton called Nature's Government. Now, most of what Drayton covers in the book occurs before this period, but it's this pattern that is developed in which through Kew, they run a network of botanic gardens around the world, whether they be Jamaica or Sri Lanka or Calcutta or wherever, and they use people trained at Kew to run them and in service of empire, which comes to be known as Imperial Botany. And so the Royal Botanic Garden at Kew becomes the center of a network of botanic gardens around the world. And this is important because it's interlinked, or it's a very important part of larger imperialism. If trade is occurring through natural products that are grown, if our understanding of the world occurs through knowing the places we control, we need to know more about the plants, the animals, and other living things of these areas, so that we can better, from an imperial perspective, make profits, extend power, and a variety of other benefits to the home country. Now, this was developed under, you could say originally under Joseph Banks, but particularly the Kew directors, the father and son of the Hookers, and then ultimately Thistleton Dyer. And they created and oversaw this global network of botanic gardens with Kew as the hub. The key thing is these Kew directors were the ones that approved the superintendents or directors of not only the Singapore Botanic Gardens, but botanic gardens throughout the world. And they set the pattern for how we are going to organize the botanical knowledge, introduce potential cultivars. So for example, when rubber eventually got its way to Kew, in Kew, they then sent it out to Calcutta, to Sri Lanka, to Singapore, to see if they could grow it in their botanic gardens. And it was Singapore that you could say broke the code or figured it out and was able to introduce rubber to this area. Now, what this ultimately meant was that Singapore, after 1874, became a branch of Kew. Okay, Kew would send the superintendents. The first two were called superintendents. Afterwards, they've all been called directors. And these were all young men or middle-aged men who had worked in Kew, literally like worked in the herbarium. Occasionally they had worked at other botanic gardens around the world. And so they sent these gentlemen to Singapore to fulfill particular tasks. The first man they sent was Henry Merton, who was here for only 5 years. The picture on the right, the white guy you see wearing the very colonial outfit and the very colonial hat there, is Henry Merton. He was followed by Nathaniel Cantley and then Henry Ridley. Now, Henry Merton is a very interesting character because he was very young. He was only about 21 or 22 when he arrived in Singapore. And he came to a garden in which he was supposed to be the boss. And even Lawrence Niven, who would be under him, was old enough to be his father. And within the very class-based system of elites and various other things in Singapore that the British brought also, he was not very well respected. People found him to be a strange young man, ordering them about, getting above his station, if you will. And so he only lasted about 5 years. And eventually he got a job at being a botanist for the King of Thailand. And a year later, in like 1881 or 1882, he fell out a window and died. Merton was replaced by Cantley. Cantley had training in Mauritius at the Botanic Gardens, and he came to Singapore and did a remarkable job of laying important foundations for the Singaporean environment. But he was in ill health and ultimately died after 8 years while he was trying to recuperate on a trip to Australia. And he was replaced then by Henry Ridley, the dominant figure at the Singapore Botanic Gardens. The key thing about all three of these individuals is they did not see themselves as working for the colonial government, if you will. They saw themselves as working for Kew. They were constantly in correspondence with the directors at Kew. They were, when they would go home on home leave, they would spend all their time at Kew. They really didn't care what was going down, what was happening at the governor's office downtown or other colonial officials. But these individuals did three very important things for Singapore and for the region. First of all, they worked in forest conservation. Secondly, the development of plantation agriculture in Singapore. And the third one was surveying the region or providing taxonomic information about the wealth of plant life, of flora in Southeast Asia. Now, the thing is, to fully understand this, we need to now go through each of these and how they transform the region. Because each of them was, after all, trying to move from, before the Singapore Botanic Gardens from 1859 to 74 had been a park. It had been a public park. Now they were establishing a scientific botanic garden. So, for example, Merton and Cantley actively exchanged plants with other colonial botanic gardens. A very common thing, but this was new for Singapore. They would collect plants, ship them off to Kew. They would always, of course, collect and press multiple copies, and then there would always be one sent to Kew. There might be sent, one might be shared with Java, with the Dutch and others. And through this, they developed a herbarium, and they developed one of the better herbariums for tropical plants in the region. They also led, not necessarily Merton and Cantley, but Ridley and those that followed, led expeditions throughout the region. And this mapped much of Southeast Asia geographically and botanically. They knew what was there and how it worked and discovered plants. And this was at the forefront of British movement into Malaya. As the British expanded their imperial control over Malaya in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, botanists went first and mapped out these places. Cantley also was very important in reestablishing the forest reserves in Singapore. I mentioned earlier that the Singapore, had become a huge cultivated landscape. By the 1880s, Singapore was 90% deforested. Realize, what this means. We had environmental problems and change in Singapore a full century and a half before the things the world is going through today. And this devastated, deforested landscape was terrible. There were reports of water supplies drying up, rainfall patterns were changing. They weren't able to literally supply the ships that were coming into the port, leastwise the residents of the region, with clean drinking water. And so plans had to be developed. One of those was to basically create a forest reserve, a lung in the center of the island, which today is known as the Central Catchment Reserve, which is this area, of course, that serves to protect reservoirs that were developed and such. This all occurred under Cantley, or at least he at least set the pattern for this. They also, and this is where they really transformed the region economically, began the acclimatization of plants. For example, coffee and rubber were introduced. Coffee eventually had problems due to disease, but rubber is the ultimate example of the success that came out of Singapore. Kew had sent rubber plants throughout the world to see if they could be acclimatized in different areas. It was planted by Merton. They were cultivated by Cantley, but it was Ridley who broke the code. He was the one that figured out how to take a wild, essentially a wild plant from Brazil, and how to plant it, how to literally take it from seed to stump, as he said. You know, how to cut the tree, how to process the latex. And this, with the coming or the ongoing Industrial Revolution, was transformational. It provided one of the key things needed for industrialization, from automobile tires to gaskets and everything else. Rubber was very important, and this was developed at the Singapore Botanic Gardens. Now, this means then we need to talk about this man, Ridley. Ridley, as you can see at the top, lived to be over 100 years old. You know, quite remarkable. But he was the ultimate imperial botanist. He was the director of the gardens for 24 years, from 1888 to 1912. And as I mentioned earlier, he tamed rubber, or he figured out how to plant rubber. The photograph, the fuzzy photograph you see on the left, is a very well-known photo. If you see any photograph of Ridley, it's usually the one on the left, where he's standing in front of the herringbone cuts on the tree, which helped produce the latex, or bring the latex out of the tree, and then it was collected. He helped develop these techniques. He figured all of this out in the experimental gardens within the Singapore Botanic Gardens. He also advocated the planting of a number of other important crops. Among those, the one that dominates Southeast Asian plantation agriculture today, the oil palm, which originally, of course, came from Africa. Rubber came from Brazil, but it's part of these larger global networks of botany. They're going to Kew. Kew sends them to Singapore, and then the botanists in Singapore figure out how to cultivate it or how to make a profit out of it, frankly. Ridley also is very important in continuing the reforestation of Singapore, because Cantley, after all, was only here for 8 years. But he was also a remarkable botanist in the sense of exploring the landscape and documenting what he saw. He identified during his career over 4,000 new species of plants. He was also, by the way, he wasn't married. He was also extremely prolific. He had over 350 publications, and they weren't all on botany. He had 68 on zoology, 12 on medicine, 8 on geology and mineralogy. And he was the editor of 2 different journals. This is a man who worked it seemingly every waking minute, and ran a botanic garden and created what I consider to be the ultimate colonial botanic garden in the world. Everything from rubber to identifying plants and everything else. The picture on the right, by the way, is Ridley holding a panther, because the gardens had a zoo from 1875 to 1905. He hated running the zoo because it meant trying to figure out how to feed the animals, for example, and the upkeep. But the zoo was very popular. It meant that a lot of people, remember, going to the Botanic Gardens is free. It meant that a lot of people were visiting the Botanic Gardens because they wanted to see the animals in the zoo. Most of the animals, by the way, were gifts from local rulers to the British government, and then they were just stored or kept in the Botanic Gardens. But through all of these efforts, particularly the development of rubber, Ridley transformed the economy of the region. What prior to his arrival, most of what Singapore and Malaya made money out of was, of course, the transshipment of goods between China and India, and also the production of tin ore. After he left, rubber dominated the economy, a natural product. And what that meant was, to work these rubber plantations, they brought in workers from India. The ownership and processing of the rubber created huge amounts of wealth. And the current Singapore leadership and all of the major banks in Singapore were all founded by people who were involved in this process, whether it be processing the rubber or being the middlemen and such like that. It laid the foundation for the modern Singaporean economy and, frankly, the local elite of Singapore. So Ridley is an amazing botanist. He is the ultimate, I would argue, imperial botanist. The thing is, a lot of people do not know much about him. And I think this picture on the right symbolizes one of the, I like this picture because he looks so small and lonely. This picture is taken in the gardens jungle. There is a part of the Botanic Gardens that has remaining primary rainforest from Singapore, part of the 10% that wasn't cut down and all the deforestation. And that's a picture of Ridley in the gardens jungle. But despite his impact, Ridley is not well known outside of Singapore. And one of the reasons is because he clashed with government officials. He had, I mentioned he was a hard worker, he was a tremendous scholar, but he was also arrogant. He was extremely arrogant. And he clashed with almost everyone he ever interacted with. He thought everyone was a fool. He didn't have time for anybody. And he would simply dismiss everyone as an idiot, frankly. He has numerous notebooks. Remember, he lived to be 100 years old. He wrote all of this down. It's all in the Kew archives. And I'm going to just say, I don't think he had many friends in Singapore. And because of this attitude that he had, this kind of demeanor that he had, a lot of it came out of the idea that he felt he was an employee of Kew. And so when colonial officials would come to him, he would just say, oh, go away, you silly man, and wouldn't do anything. And so because of that, he suffered many indignities. For example, the colonial government would continually reduce his budget. They would take away they took away forest protection from him, for example, and gave it to the Land Revenue Department. He also had, he was, never invited to parties and things. I don't think he cared, but they tried to do things to diminish him personally. Ultimately, the most symbolic thing they did to distance him from any power was they created separate departments of forestry and departments of agriculture in 1901 and 1903. And they located those in Kuala Lumpur, which was becoming the capital of Malaya. But it's probably about 300 or 400 kilometers from Singapore. In other words, it's distant. They were taking away his titles, his purview, and therefore he was no longer allowed to play a role in the development of forest or agriculture in the region. They told him just to kind of shut up and stay in Singapore. And so when he retired in 1911, there was a sense of relief among the elite. Oh, we finally got rid of that guy. And Ridley returned to England. He lived in Kew. And he was bitter till the very end. Remember, when he retired, he was 55 years old. He lived for another 45 years. And those 45 years, he wrote endless notebooks complaining about everyone he knew. They're very fun to read. They're juicy, they're gossipy, and they're extremely nasty and bitter. And because of this attitude, he became depicted as Mad Ridley, this man obsessed with rubber who was cranky. And he was, admittedly, he was a cranky man, but he was also a brilliant man, and that's often overlooked in the tales of him. I just find him an extremely fascinating individual. And when he died in 1956, he left behind all these notebooks that we can all go in and look at Kew now, which is a nice thing to do. Okay, Ridley was the director for 24 years, and it was a very productive 24 years, but it was also a very exhausting 24 years. So with Ridley out of here, the British elite could breathe a sigh of relaxation. And they arranged for the appointment of very accommodating individuals, very nice individuals to follow Ridley. They didn't want anyone who was cantankerous or problematic. And so they hired, once again, people from Kew. But the problem was the Botanic Gardens, because of Ridley, was no longer an important center. It had been diminished. For example, as I mentioned, applied, you could think of agriculture and forestry, applied botanical activities had shifted to Kuala Lumpur. And these directors still came, from Kew, but they now lived in what was increasingly being considered a park, not a science, not necessarily one that's going to change the economy of the region. The economic garden was even shut down and such. But these two botanists did very important things to contribute to the region. And they did this mainly through taxonomy and through collecting of plants and expeditions. One of the man who replaced Ridley was named Isaac Henry Burkill. And he wrote a book called the Dictionary of Economic Products of the Malay Peninsula. Perhaps the most boring title of a book ever imagined. But I have to say, when I once saw it in a bookstore, I almost lost my mind, and my wife thought I was insane. And I immediately bought it, and it has a place of honor on the shelf in my office. It is a 2-volume book that is almost 2,000 pages, in which he literally goes through every plant that was known at the time and how it's mentioned in local culture and local accounts, the applications of these plants. And so it is a wonderful, you can just pick any plant, look it up, find out about durians or mangoes and their role and how they can be used as medicine, for example. Now, after Burkill, the person that followed Burkill was named Holtom, R.E. Holtom. And Holtom was very important in the hybridization of orchids. Singapore today is very well known for its orchid production and hybrid orchids. And this is very important in establishing a local gardening industry. And these orchids are exported around the world. They become symbols of Singapore. By the way, the orchid you see on the right is a hybrid. It's the national flower of Singapore is a hybrid. It's called the Vanda Miss Joachim, who was a Eurasian woman who discovered and or developed the plant in the 1890s. But beginning in the 1930s, Holtom created an entire system of hybridizing orchids that became very important for the garden in the region. My wife, which I hope you can't see, but my wife's out there, I can see on the terrace of our house, we have orchids and she's trying to take care of them ourselves. And much of that is an echo of what Holtom had started earlier. So we have a botanic garden that was developed out of a public park. It became a very important part of Imperial Botany, or sharing with Kew. And even though it diminished in the early 20th century up till World War II, it still remained an important contributor to the society and the environment around us. But then what happens after that? What is of interest is during World War II, the Singapore Botanic Gardens became continued in a sense. World War II almost had no effect on it, the Japanese occupation. When the Japanese took over Singapore, and there were terrible battles, of course, people died, terrific upheaval, the directors of the gardens went down to the Japanese headquarters once the Japanese took over and asked to speak to the commander, and said, we have valuable things in our herbarium, we have valuable knowledge here. And they were worried that it would be destroyed or that the Japanese would do something nefarious with it. And when they met with the commander, he actually said, "Oh, good, we've been looking for you guys. Just go back to work." And that's essentially what Holtom, his assistant, the deputy director, John Corner, and other botanists, British botanists did. They went back to the gardens, they lived in the gardens, and they worked there for 3 years. And it was actually their most productive period of their careers because they no longer had administrative tasks to take care of. They wrote books. And so World War II was actually a positive, if you will, for British botany or Imperial Botany here, ironically, outside of the larger problems that were occurring due to World War II. And so following World War II, we went through, as I mentioned earlier, all of the ins and outs of decolonization in Singapore, which was extremely complicated. But the key point was, this was an institution. You can see the picture on the left is kind of the front gate at the time and people going to visit in, I believe that's the 50s or early 60s, going to visit the Botanic Gardens. But the problem is, this is an institution that is intimately wrapped up in colonialism. It is something the British founded on English landscape design. It is one in which directors are sent from Kew, and one in which the elite, the people who kind of run the show, are all British. I mean, sure, you do have workers, you have people that work in the herbarium and other very important contributors. They're local, but it's still a colonial system. And so how does such an institution fit into a decolonizing society? And this is a problem. So beginning in the 50s and the 60s and 70s, as Singapore gained independence, the Botanic Gardens grew less, I'll use the phrase, influential, less important. Botanical research shifted to the university. For example, Holton, the director in the 1930s and who had been in the Botanic Gardens during World War II, became the first professor of botany at Singapore University, which today is the National University of Singapore. So in other words, botanical research and such shifted to the university and other institutions. So what do you do with a botanic garden? Basically, it became a park. Now, they still do research on hybridization of orchids. They still did other things, but its main contributions based on the colonial era, imperial era, were over. Okay, time had changed, the plantation agriculture and other things had changed, so it was no longer as important. And due to that, it became part of the larger, I'll use the phrase, environmental bureaucracy of Singapore. It became part of the ministry, the Botanic Gardens became part of the Ministry of Environment. It's now part of the National Parks Board, for example. And so as it transitioned into this kind of a park, this colonial era was forgotten a bit, frankly, throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The government really didn't want to deal with that. This began to change in the 1980s, and particularly in the 1990s, with the appointment of a man named Tan Wee Kiat. Tan was a botanist who specialized in orchids, of course, in Singapore. But when he became the director of the gardens, he was very adamant about being a very activist director who maintained the heritage of the site, who would make sure the buildings were not torn down. Within the grounds of the Botanic Gardens, even today, you have a lot of colonial buildings like Ridley's house, Ridley's laboratory, you have these wonderful old buildings within the confines of the Botanic Gardens. Tan Wee Kiat was the person who made sure those were preserved. And if anything, many of the changes that had taken place in the 60s and 70s to make it more park-like, he reversed. He wanted it to take on the look and the design of a more scientific institution of more of the colonial Botanic Garden. So as Tan Wee Kiat grew, and Singapore, which portrays itself as the garden city, and it is a very green city, has a lot of green cover. You may be able to see outside my window there, they're quite green. The thing is, the Botanic Gardens became an important part of that greening process, but also became important. It changed symbolically as kind of the cornerstone of that greening process. And so as things developed, there was an increased appreciation of its role in society. Now, Singapore wants to also get a little bit of global recognition. And so by the early 2000s, they decided that they would try to get a World Heritage Site of some kind in Singapore. Now, there were several candidates of different, it wasn't necessarily the Botanic Gardens. They actually, I was invited to discussions of 2 or 3 different places that were discussed as potential World Heritage Sites, and the positives and negatives of each of these sites. And ultimately, the government decided to put up the Singapore Botanic Gardens as a World Heritage Site. As part of that process, they hired a botanist. They in a sense, returned to Kew. Despite, since decolonization, they no longer wanted to hire a British citizen to run their botanic garden. After all, this is an independent state. Beginning in the early 20-teens, they hired Nigel Taylor, who had been the curator at Kew and had helped shepherd Kew's application for World Heritage status and achieved that. They hired Nigel to be the director of the Botanic Gardens. And he successfully did the same task here in Singapore. In 2015, on the 50th anniversary of national independence in Singapore, the Botanic Gardens was named, as Nicolette mentioned earlier, the 3rd botanic garden in the world that is a World Heritage Site. It is still free to visit. It is quite expansive. It's in the, today, as Singapore has expanded and built up, it's kind of in the center or in the middle of the downtown, or kind of the northern part of the downtown area, but in a very central location. And what I always like about the Botanic Gardens is that it achieved this status as a cultural site, not a natural site, because it is something that has been shaped by humans. It has been developed by humans. And so the Singapore Botanic Gardens is really a product. It is a product of imperialism. It is a product of global scientific research. And it is a place that is reflective of that history. And so it's very much a worthy candidate for World Heritage status. And Singapore takes great pride in that status that they achieved. Even to today, it's the only World Heritage Site. We're a small country, and so that's fine. But let me kind of, let me do one more. So let me just kind of wrap this all up, and then we can open the floor to questions. But I really want you to think of the Singapore Botanic Garden as nature's colony. If Richard Drayton talked about nature's government, running it from Kew, the Botanic Gardens here in Singapore were that colony that they were running from Kew. It was a place in which Kew botanists came to develop products that were for empire, for the profit of empire. And through their work, they helped map the region. They helped us better understand the flora of the region. And then it also became an important basis for the development of the nation. So the Botanic Gardens is important for the empire, for the region, and for the nation. And it's a beautiful site. I think all visitors of Singapore should go see it. And so if you're not from Singapore and you happen to come to Singapore, please put it at the top of your list. It is free to visit. And so you can just add to those numbers that go through the gates every day. This is the famous gates at the main entrance to the gardens. And so I'd like to thank you. Hopefully you're still awake and paying attention. But what I'll do is I'll turn this over to questions that you might have. And then that way we can see how we're doing and do it with that. Sorry.
Thank you, Tim. That was absolutely fascinating. I've learned a great deal. know Kew and I know Kirsten Bosch, but I know you very little about Singapore, and it's fascinating transformation, I think, from its early days to a modern garden used for both pleasure and botanic purposes, which I think is really, you know, it's quite an achievement, and the World Heritage status obviously recognizes that. Are there any questions from anybody? I see there's one here. No, anyone have any questions? No,
Come
that's
on.
thanking you. I think we've all enjoyed it greatly. And just wait a few moments to see if anybody has anything that comes up in the chat, or anybody would like to say anything. Or maybe you've stunned us all into silence with so much amazing.
Or everyone's asleep. That's my theory.
Well, it's either early in the morning for some people, or otherwise.
Yeah, the lady from Jamaica, I got to give complete credit to. You know,
My
tip
goodness,
of the hat.
yes. I think top marks for her. We also do have our next talk will be on the 18th of May about Caribbean Botanic Gardens. So hopefully everybody will get up early or stay up late for that. And I'm sure will be fascinating as well. And we've got several more in the series to look forward to. So thank you so much.
Okay, wait, I see a question. Someone wrote and asked, Steph L asked, is there a place where we can read Ridley's journals? The easiest, they're in Kew. They're in the Royal Botanic Gardens Library and Archives. And so you can just request to see them. Now, because Ridley lived so long and only died in 1956, I mean, they're very open at Kew. They're very nice to let you look at them. It's not a problem. But I've always dreamed of republishing these or making them available in some manner. But we need to wait till he's been dead for 75 years. And that guy lived a long time. Now, that's coming up. We're getting close. We're getting mighty close. Or is it 80? I forget what they once told me at Kew about 5 years ago. I just need to wait a bit so we can get past the release date type thing. But if you'd like to read them, they're in the Kew Botanic Gardens archives. In many of my writings, whether there are where I write about the Singapore Botanic Gardens, I always quote very liberally from Ridley's notebooks because they are so gossipy and juicy, and you know, and he always has the right adjectives to describe anyone. There a question from Marianne Yo from Hong Kong also asked, are there any non-imperial botanic gardens in Singapore or modern botanic gardens? And yes, there are. I mean, one of the more famous, if you think of Singapore today, there is a thing they call the super tree, which is this basically fake tree that they have vines growing on that is probably 75, 100 meters in the air. And it is the core of what is known as Gardens by the Bay. When Tan Wee Kiat retired from the Singapore Botanic Gardens, in the Marina Bay area, which is kind of the main tourist area, it's where there's a casino, there's tall buildings and such, they have built a new botanic garden there called Gardens by the Bay. And in that book, in that garden, they have, two domes that look like, what's the thing in England, the Eden Project?
Eden Project.
Yeah, the Eden Project. They have two domes that look like the Eden Project. And in one of the domes, they grow, because we're the tropics, they grow desert plants. And in the other one, they cultivate high mountain, cool tropical plants. And you can go in these massive domes. They are a wonder to see, frankly. And you can go into those. I'm not a huge fan of that one because it's fairly artificial, and I can see that Marianne's not a fan of it either. She means natural botanic gardens, and okay, fair enough. But in Singapore, I would say no. We have a lot of national parks. It's how we designate things. There are various parks in which they cultivate the plants for the replanting and the greening of Singapore, which you could argue are kind of botanical gardens, but they're just not designated in such a manner, at least for Singapore. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose I wonder if there are any botanic gardens in the world that are actually modern ones that weren't founded, you know, sort of early on in countries' histories, whether they're any that have been founded in recent times. I mean, that's an
Yeah,
interesting question.
I mean, because they're mainly, most botanic gardens are associated either with, we'll say, imperialism or universities. I mean, of course, you have like the botanic garden that's in Leiden in the Netherlands, you know, where they originally, you know, set things up. But the thing is, yeah, I don't really know of modern botanic gardens. I think that would be such a formidable task to take upon. I'm not so sure where you're going to get the funding for that one. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure there probably are some, but perhaps we don't necessarily know about them. I suppose Kew Gardens, or if you ask people at Botanic Gardens, they might well know.
Right. Well, see, in Singapore, what they've done is there's, as I have said several times, we're only 30 kilometers by 50 kilometers. And therefore, it's kind of relatively easy to connect things up. We have what are called park connectors here. And so we do have a lot of, the government is very intent on creating garden space. But that is depicted as parks. So I also think a lot of it is how you call it, if you will. But all of that gardening, or the impetus for it, comes through the Singapore Botanic Gardens. In a sense, the Singapore Botanic Gardens is the central hub, much like Kew, for the rest of the island. So.
No, it's interesting. Yes, and because, as you say, it's a small place, its place in that within Singapore is so important, and it informs all the other gardens around it, which is really interesting. Someone said we have an arid zone botanic gardens in Port Augusta, Australia. That's interesting. So, you know, I'm sure there are many that we perhaps not aware about. I mean, we're going to have a talk on botanic gardens in Australia, and a talk on botanic gardens in New Zealand, all coming up in the next few weeks and couple of months. So I hope you'll join us for some of those. As well others who are with us today. I think it's been a very, very interesting series, and thank you so much for contributing to that. I don't know if there's anything else anyone else would like to ask. We're 11 o'clock now, so we probably will wrap up in a moment otherwise. But I think hopefully it's whetted everyone's appetite now to visit Singapore, or if people have been, want to go back there.
We only opened up about 2 weeks ago, so.
Oh, right, brilliant. Perfect timing. Yes, and hopefully that won't happen again, where everything locks down and we all get stuck. So I certainly whetted my appetite to visit, and I hope I will one day. But no, it's fascinating. Thank you so much. And I think, seeing as nobody else has asked anything else, we'll wrap it up and say thank you very much to yourself for agreeing to join us. And hopefully you will join us at some of the other talks, if the timing is okay, for our various zones around the world, where we've tried to accommodate everybody within those times. And thanks to Jess for looking after the technical side of our talk this morning. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you at the next talk in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks, Tim. Righto. Bye, everybody.